So I was looking at the reports and I noticed that our sales are down again.
Mom?
Do you have any ideas for it?
Mom!
Excuse me, hold 1 second. I'm sorry, sweetie, I'm on the phone. Hey, sweetie.
Now you care. Business is the only thing that matters to you.
That's not true.
Well,
I've been
it
your
seems like
stepmother since you were a baby. Look, Lucas is an idiot, all right? Just move on from boys.
I am not a lesbian, Mom.
I didn't say that you were. You just need to learn how to seduce someone. I'll teach you everything you need to know, and then you can land any guy or any girl you want. Get really close to them.
This scene centers on India and Shyla and unfolds as a deceptively intimate chamber piece that uses a moment of emotional crisis to explore power, care, and self-recognition within a lesbian framework that resists sensationalism and instead insists on interiority and consequence, beginning with India's presentation as the archetype of competence and control. A woman whose financial success and professional fluency have allowed her to curate a life of luxury and apparent self-sufficiency, and whose relationship with Shyla initially appears to follow a familiar arrangement in which stability and material comfort stand in for emotional presence. Yet the film quickly complicates this image by situating India in a moment where her habitual emotional distance is no longer sufficient. Because Shyla, usually careful not to interrupt or inconvenience, is visibly and unmistakably wounded. Her sadness quiet but heavy, the kind of sadness that comes from internalized failure rather than temporary disappointment. And the script's choice to make Shyla someone who respects India's work boundaries underscores how women are often socialized to minimize their needs, especially in relationships, where one partner's labor or authority is positioned as more urgent or legitimate than the other's emotional life. When Shyla finally speaks, revealing that her boyfriend has left her for being incapable of romance, the film avoids caricature and instead frames this as a devastating confirmation of a fear Shyla already carries, that she is somehow lacking a fundamental capacity that others seem to possess effortlessly, a fear that resonates far beyond heterosexual scripts and speaks to queer experiences of being told, implicitly or explicitly, that one's way of loving is inadequate, incomplete, or improperly expressed, and India's response, initially framed as pragmatic resolve rather than tenderness, reflects another recognizable pattern among queer women who have learned to survive by mastering systems rather than emotions, who approach intimacy as something that can be explained, demonstrated, optimized, or taught, believing that competence can substitute for vulnerability. The scene's emotional tension hinges on this dynamic, because India's decision to help Shyla is sincere yet compromised, blending care with control, mentorship with seduction, and generosity with self-confirmation. And the film is careful not to romanticize this imbalance, but instead to let it breathe, showing how easily assistance can become instruction, and how instruction can slide into a quiet assertion of superiority, particularly in queer contexts where experience itself can function as a form of authority. As India shows Shyla her personal understanding of romance, the camera and script remain firmly focused on faces, pauses, and language rather than actions, emphasizing how intimacy is negotiated through attention, affirmation, and the permission to feel seen. And it is here that the film's queer sensibility is most apparent, because what is being transmitted is not a set of techniques or behaviors, but a reframing of desire itself, an invitation for Shyla to understand herself as someone worthy of attention and responsiveness, an invitation that feels intoxicating precisely because it is so rare. And Shyla's falling into the trap is portrayed not as foolishness, but as a deeply human response to being recognized, a moment that many lesbian and queer women will recognize from their own histories of mistaking intensity for safety or mentorship for mutuality in environments where models for healthy queer intimacy are scarce. The narrative choice to frame India as someone who has been through many such dynamics before adds a layer of melancholy rather than triumph, suggesting a pattern of repetition that benefits her sense of mastery while leaving others transformed but not necessarily protected. And this ambiguity is crucial to the film's ethical seriousness, as it refuses to cast India as either villain or savior, and instead positions her as a woman shaped by a world that rewards emotional detachment and punishes softness, even as it commodifies intimacy as something that can be possessed or performed. When the scene shifts to Shyla being invited to express herself in return, the emphasis is again not on reversal of roles but on emergence, on what happens when someone who has been told she lacks romance is given space to respond without judgment. And Shyla's ability to show her stuff becomes less about impressing India and more about discovering her own language of connection, a discovery that destabilizes the original power imbalance by revealing that intimacy is not a finite resource controlled by the more experienced partner, but a relational process that grows through trust and attention. And this moment resonates strongly with queer viewers who have experienced the shock of realizing that desire and care can surface organically once fear recedes. The film does not resolve this exchange into a neat affirmation of equality or mutual fulfillment, instead allowing the viewer to sit with the unresolved implications of what has occurred, including the possibility that India's confidence may be more fragile than she admits, and that Shyla's newfound self-recognition may eventually demand more than India is prepared to give, a tension that mirrors real-world queer relationships where growth in one partner can unsettle the structures that once felt secure. On a broader level, the scene functions as a commentary on how women are taught to manage emotion within hierarchies, whether professional, romantic, or social, and how lesbian relationships, often imagined as inherently egalitarian, can nonetheless reproduce dynamics of expertise and dependence when one woman's self-assuredness is positioned as corrective to another's perceived lack. And by foregrounding Shyla's initial deference and India's habitual control, the film invites viewers to consider how emotional labor is distributed and valued, particularly in contexts where one woman's productivity or success is used, consciously or not, to justify her emotional unavailability. The discomfort that surrounds women loving women is subtly woven throughout the scene, not through external antagonism but through internalized scripts that shape how both characters understand what they are doing, with India framing her actions as instruction rather than desire, and Shyla initially interpreting her responsiveness as proof of deficiency rather than capacity, reflecting a cultural tendency to rationalize or instrumentalize lesbian intimacy in order to make it legible and non-threatening. By refusing spectacle and focusing instead on emotional process, the film resists both erasure and sensationalization, insisting that women's relationships with each other deserve the same narrative gravity afforded to heterosexual romance, complete with ambivalence, ethical tension, and the possibility of harm alongside care. The scene's resonance extends beyond queer audiences by tapping into universal experiences of burnout, self-doubt, and the longing to be met without explanation, particularly for women who have been rewarded for competence at the expense of vulnerability and who may recognize in India a version of themselves that feels powerful but isolated, or in Shyla a version that feels open but uncertain. And the film's refusal to assign clear moral judgment allows for a more nuanced reflection on how these traits coexist within individuals, rather than mapping neatly onto separate characters. Within queer communities specifically, the dynamics on display echo familiar conversations about mentorship, age or experience gaps, and the thin line between guidance and influence, highlighting how the scarcity of visible queer pathways can lead women to seek validation from those who appear more established, and how those with greater confidence or social capital may struggle to disentangle genuine care from the affirmation they receive by being needed. Ultimately, this scene contributes to the film's larger project of portraying lesbian intimacy as a site of serious emotional inquiry rather than provocation, using India and Shyla's interaction to ask what it means to help someone discover themselves without claiming ownership over that discovery, and whether it is possible to offer connection without reinforcing hierarchy in a world that already ranks women so aggressively. And by situating this question within a quiet, emotionally charged exchange rather than dramatic confrontation, the film honors the lived reality of many women whose most formative relational moments occur not in grand gestures but in private conversations, shared silences, and the careful testing of trust. The scene's power lies in its recognition that becoming visible to oneself often happens through another's attention. Yet this process is fraught with risk, especially for queer women whose desires have been historically surveilled, dismissed, or distorted, and the film's commitment to treating this moment with seriousness and restraint affirms that women's love for women, in all its complexity, deserves to be seen not as a curiosity or fantasy, but as a profound and ongoing negotiation between autonomy and connection, care and control, knowledge and vulnerability, a negotiation that continues long after the scene ends and invites viewers to reflect on their own patterns of giving, receiving, and recognizing intimacy in a world still learning how to fully acknowledge it.